I should have listened to the locals in town. The way their faces darkened when I mentioned Belmont Plantation, how they quickly changed the subject or crossed themselves. But I was stubborn, driven by my research into antebellum architecture, and the chance to document one of Louisiana's most notorious abandoned estates was too tempting to pass up. The wrought iron gates stood twisted and rusted, hanging askew like broken wings. Spanish moss draped the entrance like funeral shrouds, and even in the afternoon sun, shadows seemed to pool unnaturally thick beneath the ancient oak trees. I parked my rental car and grabbed my camera equipment, ignoring the chill that ran down my spine despite the humid October heat. The plantation house loomed before me, its white columns stained with decades of neglect, paint peeling like diseased skin. Vines had claimed the wraparound porch, and several windows were boarded up with weathered planks that looked like dead eyes. I knew the history, built in 1847 by Jeremiah Belmont, a man whose cruelty toward the enslaved people who worked his land had become legend. The story spoke of torture, of people disappearing into the night, of screams that echoed across the cotton fields until dawn. I climbed the sagging porch steps, each board groaning under my weight like a dying breath. The front door hung open, inviting me into the darkness beyond. I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside. The air hit me like a physical force, thick, oppressive, and carrying the scent of decay mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. My footsteps echoed in the grand foyer, where a massive chandelier hung precariously overhead, its crystals dulled with grime and cobwebs. That's when I heard it, the first sound that shouldn't have been there. A soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I called out, thinking perhaps another explorer or vagrant had taken shelter here, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. I moved through the parlor, my flashlight beam dancing across water-stained wallpaper and furniture covered in white sheets that looked disturbingly like funeral shrouds. Portrait frames hung empty on the walls, their subjects long since rotted away, leaving only dark rectangles that seemed to watch my progress. The floorboards beneath my feet began to sag ominously as I approached what must have been the dining room. Here, a long table still stood, set as if for a dinner party that would never come. Plates covered in a film of dust, wine glasses that caught my flashlight beam and threw twisted shadows on the walls. But it was the chair at the head of the table that made me freeze. It was different from the others, larger, more ornate, and unlike the rest of the furniture, it showed no signs of decay. The leather was still rich and dark, and as I stared, I could swear I saw the impression of someone sitting in it, the cushion slightly depressed as if bearing invisible weight. A door slammed somewhere in the house. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound had come from upstairs, violent and sudden in the suffocating quiet. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, that old houses settled and shifted, but there was no wind. The air was perfectly still, unnaturally so. Fighting every instinct screaming at me to leave, I made my way to the grand staircase. The banister was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in my flashlight beam. As I climbed, the temperature dropped noticeably, and my breath began to mist in front of my face. The second-floor hallway stretched before me like a throat, lined with doors that gaped open into rooms I couldn't bring myself to look into too closely. But I could feel eyes watching me from those darkened doorways, could sense movement just beyond the reach of my light. That's when I heard the crying. It started as a whisper, so soft I thought it might be the wind through broken windows. But it grew stronger, more distinct, the sound of a woman weeping, heartbroken and desperate. The sound was coming from the room at the end of the hall, and despite every rational thought telling me to run, I found myself walking toward it. The master bedroom was a monument to decay. The four-poster bed dominated the space, its canopy hanging in tatters. But it was the mirror on the far wall that captured my attention, an enormous thing with an ornate silver frame that somehow remained untarnished despite the ruin around it. I approached it slowly, my reflection wavering in the old glass. But as I got closer, I realized my reflection wasn't alone. Behind me, barely visible in the mirror's surface, stood the silhouette of a woman in a tattered dress. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, she was closer. Much closer. Her face was pale as bone, her eyes hollow sockets of shadow, and her mouth was open in an eternal scream I couldn't hear. Cracks spiderwebbed across the mirror's surface, originating from where her reflection touched the glass. I stumbled backward, knocking into a small table. The impact sent something rolling across the floor, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. My hands shaking, I opened it and began to read by flashlight. The entries were written in a woman's delicate script, dating back to 1849. Margaret Belmont, Jeremiah's wife, documenting the horrors she witnessed. The beatings, the killings, her husband's descent into madness and cruelty. But it was the final entries that made my blood freeze. He has begun the rituals in the cellar. The screams. God help me, the screams. He says the darkness speaks to him, promises him power over life and death. I tried to stop him, tried to help them escape, but he found out. Tomorrow he says I'll join them below. I pray someone finds this, that someone knows the truth of what happened here. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned to see the bedroom door slowly closing, its hinges shrieking like a wounded animal. The temperature plummeted, and my breath came out in great white puffs. The crying had stopped, replaced by something infinitely worse, the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. A man's footsteps. I ran to the window, but the boards were nailed tight. The footsteps were in the hallway now, accompanied by a dragging sound, as if something was being pulled across the floor. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. I pressed myself against the far wall, my flashlight beam dancing wildly. The door opened, but nothing came through, nothing I could see. Yet the temperature continued to drop, and frost began forming on the window glass. The mirror cracked further, the sound like breaking bones. That's when I saw him. Jeremiah Belmont materialized in the doorway like smoke given form. Tall and gaunt, dressed in the rotting remains of what had once been fine clothes. His face was a map of decay, skin hanging in strips from yellowed bone, and his eyes. His eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence that spoke of centuries of rage and hatred. He smiled, revealing teeth like broken glass, and when he spoke, his voice was the sound of dirt falling on a coffin lid. Welcome to my home. I ran. Somehow, I found the strength to push past that nightmare figure and bolt down the hallway. Behind me, I could hear his laughter, a sound like screaming wind through a graveyard. The house itself seemed to fight my escape, floorboards giving way beneath my feet, doorways narrowing to trap me, but terror gave me speed. I reached the stairs and took them 3 at a time, the banister crumbling under my grip. The front door seemed impossibly far away, and with each step, I could feel Belmont behind me, could smell the stench of his decay, could hear his whispered promises of what he would do to me. But I made it. I burst through that door and into the fading daylight, gasping and sobbing. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as shadows seemed to reach for me from the porch. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, and I floored the accelerator, gravel spraying behind me as I raced away from that accursed place. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I dared to look in my rearview mirror. The plantation house stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, but there in one of the upstairs windows, I could see a figure watching me leave. Waiting. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached New Orleans. I checked into a hotel and tried to convince myself it had all been my imagination, some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by the oppressive atmosphere of the place. But that night, I dreamed of the cellar Margaret Belmont had written about. In my dream, I descended those stairs, my flashlight revealing horrors beyond description. Bodies chained to walls, some still moving, still trying to scream through throats long since ruined. And at the center of it all, an altar stained black with centuries of blood, where Jeremiah Belmont conducted his unholy rituals. I woke screaming, covered in sweat despite the hotel's air conditioning running full blast. And there, on the nightstand beside my bed, was the leather journal I'd left behind at the plantation. I never went back to Louisiana. I never published my research on antebellum architecture. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I can hear that laughter echoing in my memory. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of a tall, gaunt figure in my peripheral vision, watching and waiting. The locals in that small town were right to warn me. Some places are meant to remain undisturbed, their secrets buried with the dead. But Belmont Plantation doesn't let its visitors leave unchanged. It marks them, claims them, and ensures that a part of them always remains within its rotting walls. I've moved 3 times since that night, always to places far from Louisiana, but it doesn't matter. Distance means nothing to the dead. They have all the time in the world, and they never forget. Last night, I found muddy footprints leading from my front door to my bedroom. Heavy footprints, like those of a man who's been walking through centuries of Mississippi mud. And on my pillow, I found a single cotton bowl, dried and blackened with age. He's coming for me. I can feel it in my bones, in the way shadows seem to linger too long in corners, in the way my reflection sometimes shows more than just myself. Jeremiah Belmont isn't finished with me yet. The plantation may be hundreds of miles away, but its evil has followed me home. I'm writing this as a warning, a record of what I found at Belmont Plantation. If something happens to me, if I disappear or if they find me dead under mysterious circumstances, know that it was him. Know that the evil in that place is real, and it's hungry. Don't go there. Don't even drive past it. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some invitations to hell come wrapped in Spanish moss and southern charm. The sun is setting now, and the shadows in my room are growing longer. I can hear footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment, slow and deliberate. The same footsteps I heard in that cursed house. He's here. The rusted gate groaned like a dying animal as I pushed it open, its hinges protesting after decades of neglect. I should have turned back then. God, I should have listened to the locals in town when they crossed themselves and whispered warnings about Blackwood Plantation. But I was young, foolish, and desperate for the story that would launch my journalism career. The overgrown dirt road stretched before me like a wound through the Louisiana swampland, Spanish moss hanging from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, as if the very air itself was trying to push me back. The late October sun filtered weakly through the canopy, casting everything in a sickly green light that made my skin crawl. I had driven 3 hours from New Orleans to investigate reports of paranormal activity at the abandoned Blackwood Plantation. Built in 1847 by Silas Blackwood, the estate had been home to unspeakable cruelties during the antebellum period. Local historians spoke in hushed tones about the hundreds of enslaved souls who had suffered and died on these grounds, their blood literally soaked into the soil beneath my feet. The main house materialized through the trees like something from a nightmare. 3 stories of rotting grandeur, its white columns stained with decades of decay, paint peeling like diseased skin. Broken shutters hung at odd angles, and several windows gaped like empty eye sockets. But it was the silence that unnerved me most. Not even the buzz of insects or chirp of birds disturbed the oppressive quiet. I pulled out my digital recorder and camera, my hands already trembling though I told myself it was just the October chill. Day 1 at Blackwood Plantation, I whispered into the device. Approximately 3:47 p.m. The atmosphere is unsettling. As I approached the front steps, a cold wind suddenly whipped through the clearing, despite the fact that the air had been perfectly still moments before. The temperature dropped at least 20 degrees in seconds, and I could see my breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. That's when I heard it for the first time, a low, mournful humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The front door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. Or daring me. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I had come too far to turn back now. I pushed the door open, wincing as it creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing through the cavernous interior like a death knell. The smell hit me immediately, a nauseating mixture of decay, mildew, and something else. Something metallic and organic that made my stomach lurch. The grand foyer stretched before me, once elegant wallpaper now peeling and water-stained, revealing dark patches underneath that looked disturbingly like bloodstains. A massive staircase dominated the space, its banister carved with intricate designs that seemed to writhe and shift in my peripheral vision. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through broken windows, but they moved wrong somehow, swirling in patterns that defied the still air. I had barely taken 3 steps inside when the door slammed shut behind me with a thunderous bang. I spun around, heart hammering, and tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. The ornate brass knob turned freely, but the door remained sealed as if welded shut. Okay, I whispered to myself, fighting down panic. Just a warped door. Old house settling. Nothing supernatural about it. But even as I spoke the words, I didn't believe them. The air inside felt thick and oppressive, pressing against me like invisible hands. And that humming had returned, joined now by what sounded like whispered voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I forced myself to explore the ground floor, documenting everything with my camera. The dining room contained a massive table set for 12, complete with rotting food that should have decomposed decades ago. Maggots writhed through the putrid feast, but they were wrong too large, too pale, moving with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. In what had once been a parlor, I found children's toys scattered across the floor. But these weren't the playthings of the plantation owner's children, they were crude dolls made from corn husks and scraps of fabric, the kind enslaved children would have fashioned from whatever materials they could find. Their button eyes seemed to follow me as I moved through the room. The whispers grew louder as I approached the kitchen, and I could swear I heard chains rattling somewhere in the walls. The massive fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened not just with soot but with something that looked disturbingly like charred bone fragments. It was there that I saw her for the first time. She stood in the corner, partially transparent but unmistakably present, a young black woman in tattered clothing, her wrists bearing the unmistakable marks of shackles. Her eyes held a pain so deep it physically hurt to look at her. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she raised one ghostly hand and pointed toward the back of the house. I followed her gesture with my gaze and saw a door I hadn't noticed before, painted the same color as the walls but clearly outlined now that I knew to look for it. The woman flickered and vanished, but her message was clear, she wanted me to go through that door. Every rational part of my mind screamed against it, but I found myself walking toward the hidden entrance anyway. The doorknob was ice cold against my palm, so cold it burned. The door opened onto a narrow staircase leading down into absolute darkness. The basement. Of course it would be the basement. I pulled out my phone's flashlight, surprised to see the battery had drained from full to 30% in the short time I'd been inside. The light beam seemed weak and sickly, swallowed by the darkness ahead. But I had no choice now, something was drawing me forward with invisible threads, and I was powerless to resist. The stairs creaked ominously under my weight, each step taking me deeper into the bowels of the plantation. The walls were rough stone, weeping with moisture that felt warm and sticky against my fingers when I steadied myself. The smell down here was worse, that metallic odor now clearly identifiable as old blood, mixed with human waste and the sweet stench of death. At the bottom of the stairs, my flashlight illuminated a long corridor lined with heavy wooden doors. Slave quarters. But these weren't the cabins I'd read about in historical accounts, these were cells, underground prisons where the most defiant souls had been broken through torture and deprivation. The whispers had become a chorus now, dozens of voices speaking in overlapping fragments. I could make out individual words, help, remember, justice, pain, but they blended together into a cacophony of anguish that made my head throb. I approached the first cell, my hand shaking as I lifted the rusty latch. Inside, the beam of my light revealed shackles bolted to the walls, their metal stained dark with rust and worse things. Scratches covered every surface, tally marks counting endless days, desperate pleas carved into stone, and images that hurt to look at too closely. But it was the second cell that nearly broke my sanity. The door hung open, and inside I could see them, dozens of ghostly figures huddled together, men, women, and children whose lives had ended in this hellish place. They turned toward my light with eyes that held centuries of suffering, their mouths opening in silent screams that I could somehow hear in my bones. One of them, a man with scars crisscrossing his ghostly flesh, stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice echoed inside my skull rather than reaching my ears. "You came," he said, his words carrying the weight of desperate hope. "You came to bear witness." I don't understand," I stammered, my voice cracking. "The truth," whispered a woman holding a spectral child. "The truth must be told. What happened here? What was done to us? It cannot be forgotten." Suddenly, the corridor filled with more spirits than I could count. They pressed around me, not threatening but pleading, their phantom hands reaching out to touch me. Where their fingers made contact, I felt their memories flooding into my mind, a torrent of pain, fear, and unimaginable cruelty. I saw through their eyes the horrors that had taken place in these cells. I felt the bite of the whip, the agony of starvation, the despair of watching loved ones die. I experienced their final moments, some succumbing to disease, others to violence, many to despair so complete it stopped their hearts. But worse than their deaths were their lives, the daily degradation, the systematic destruction of their humanity, the way their very existence had been reduced to property lines in account books. The plantation's wealth had been built on their suffering, and their torment had soaked into the very foundations of this place. Remember us, they pleaded in unison. Tell our stories. Don't let them be forgotten. I tried to speak, to promise them I would, but no words came. The visions continued to pour into my mind, each one more horrific than the last. I saw Silas Blackwood himself, a man whose cruelty had been legendary even in a time when such cruelty was legal. I watched him devise new tortures, new ways to break the human spirit while keeping the body alive to work. The worst revelation came last, the truth about the basement cells. They hadn't been used just for punishment. They had been Blackwood's private chamber of horrors, where he conducted experiments on human beings, testing the limits of pain and endurance. The scratches on the walls weren't just desperate pleas, they were scientific notations, carved by victims forced to document their own torture. I collapsed to my knees, overwhelmed by the weight of their suffering. The spirits surrounded me, their presence both comforting and terrifying. They had been waiting here for over a century, trapped by the magnitude of the injustice done to them, unable to rest until someone bore witness to their truth. "I'll tell everyone," I gasped, tears streaming down my face. "I'll make sure the world knows what happened here." The moment I spoke those words, something changed. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and I felt a collective sigh of relief from the assembled spirits. One by one, they began to fade, but not into nothingness, into something that looked almost like peace. The man who had first spoken to me lingered longest. "Thank you, child," he said, his voice growing fainter. "Our names. They're carved in the stone behind you. Remember our names." I turned to look where he pointed, and my flashlight illuminated a wall covered in carefully carved text. Hundreds of names, etched deep into the stone by hands that had somehow found the strength to ensure they wouldn't be entirely forgotten. Sarah, age 19. Moses, age 34. Little Mary, age 6. The list went on and on, a memorial created by the victims themselves. As the last spirit faded away, I was alone in the basement. But it no longer felt malevolent, just sad, infinitely sad. I photographed every name, every carving, every detail I could capture. The battery on my phone should have died hours ago, but somehow it held enough charge for me to document everything. When I finally climbed back up those stairs, I found the hidden door standing wide open, and sunlight streaming through the windows above. The front door, which had been sealed shut, now opened easily at my touch. I stumbled outside into the late afternoon air, gasping as if I'd been underwater. I published my article 3 weeks later, including the photographs and the complete list of names I'd found carved into that basement wall. The story went viral, shared millions of times across social media. Historians confirmed the details I'd uncovered, and archaeologists were granted permission to excavate the site. They found everything exactly as I described it: the hidden basement, the cells, the carved names. They also found something I hadn't seen in my ghostly visions, a detailed journal kept by Silas Blackwood himself, hidden in a sealed compartment behind the basement wall. His own words confirmed every horror the spirits had shown me, documented in the cold, clinical language of a man who saw human beings as laboratory specimens. The journal sparked a national conversation about slavery, memory, and the importance of preserving even the most painful parts of our history. A memorial was erected on the site, bearing the names of every soul who had suffered and died there. The Blackwood plantation became a place of remembrance rather than horror. But I never went back. I couldn't. Because sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I can hear them, the whispers of those who trusted me with their truth. They're at peace now, but their voices remain with me, a constant reminder that some stories are too important to be forgotten, no matter how much they hurt to tell. The living often ask me if I was afraid that night in the plantation. The answer is yes, I was terrified. But not of the ghosts. I was afraid of the truth they showed me, afraid of the capacity for evil that humans can harbor, afraid of how easily such horrors can be forgotten by those who find them inconvenient to remember. The real horror of Blackwood Plantation wasn't supernatural at all. It was entirely, devastatingly human. And that, perhaps, is the most frightening truth of all. The GPS had been dead for 20 miles when I finally saw the rusted sign, Millfield Plantation, Historical Site. My headlights carved through the suffocating darkness as I turned down the gravel road, each pothole sending shockwaves through my rental car. I was here for my dissertation research on antebellum architecture, but as the forest pressed closer on both sides, I began to question my decision to come alone. The trees seemed wrong somehow, too tall, too twisted, their branches reaching across the narrow road like gnarled fingers trying to snare passing travelers. Spanish moss hung in thick curtains, swaying without any discernible breeze. My headlights caught glimpses of shapes moving between the trunks, but when I looked directly, nothing was there. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, the forest suddenly gave way to a vast clearing. The plantation house rose before me like a monument to forgotten horrors. 3 stories of rotting antebellum grandeur, its white paint peeling away in long strips that fluttered in the wind like dead skin. Tall columns supported a wraparound porch that sagged under the weight of decay and time. I parked near what had once been a fountain, now cracked and filled with stagnant water that reflected the pale moon like a dead eye. The silence was absolute, no insects, no night birds, nothing but the whisper of wind through the dying magnolia trees that flanked the house. My footsteps echoed hollow on the wooden porch steps. Several boards groaned ominously under my weight, and I could see through gaps where the wood had rotted away entirely. The front door stood slightly ajar, darkness yawning beyond it like an open mouth. I pushed it open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. The smell hit me first, a mixture of mold, decay, and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. My flashlight beam revealed a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase that curved up into shadow. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to track my movement. The wallpaper, once probably elegant, now hung in moldering strips. As I stepped inside, the floorboards groaned beneath my feet with sounds like distant screams. I told myself it was just old wood settling, but the rational part of my mind was already retreating, overwhelmed by an instinctual fear that seemed to seep from the very walls. I began documenting the architectural details, taking photos and measurements, trying to focus on my work and ignore the growing sense that I was not alone. Every shadow seemed to harbor movement. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. When I turned to photograph the staircase, I could have sworn I saw a figure in white at the top, but my light revealed only empty space. The dining room was a tableau of interrupted life. The long mahogany table was still set for dinner, though the fine china was cracked and covered in dust. 13 place settings, I counted twice to be sure. 12 chairs surrounded the table, but the 13th sat alone at the far end, facing away from the others. Its high back cast a shadow that seemed too large, too dark. I approached carefully, my footsteps muffled by a carpet that squelched wetly beneath my feet. When I reached the solitary chair, I saw why it faced away. Carved into its back were names, dozens of them, etched deep into the wood as if by desperate fingernails. Sarah, age 12. Thomas, age 8. Mary, age 15. The list went on, each name accompanied by an age, most disturbingly young. A sound from the kitchen made me spin around, the distinct clatter of dishes. My light revealed nothing but an empty doorway leading into darkness. I waited, holding my breath, but the silence stretched on until I began to wonder if I'd imagined it. The kitchen, when I finally worked up the courage to enter it, was a scene from a nightmare. Pots and pans hung from hooks above an enormous cast-iron stove, but they swayed gently as if recently disturbed. The preparation counter was stained dark with something that might have been old blood, and the air was thick with the smell of rotting meat. But it was the cellar door that truly unnerved me. It stood open, revealing stone steps that descended into absolute blackness. A cold draft rose from below, carrying with it the stench of death and something else, the sound of weeping, so faint I almost convinced myself it was wind. I knew I should leave. Every instinct screamed at me to run back to my car and drive away from this cursed place. But I was a researcher, trained to seek truth even when it was uncomfortable. And there was something down there that demanded to be discovered. The stone steps were slick with moisture, and my flashlight revealed walls lined with what looked like slave quarters, tiny cells with iron bars, each barely large enough for a person to lie down. But these weren't just quarters. They were dungeons. The walls were covered in scratches, desperate clawings of fingernails against stone. In one cell, shackles still hung from the wall, their chains ending in manacles stained dark with rust and worse things. The weeping grew louder as I moved deeper into the cellar. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the stone walls until it became a chorus of anguish that made my skin crawl. I found the source in the deepest part of the cellar, a well, its stone rim worn smooth by countless hands. When I shone my light down into it, I saw them. Bodies. Dozens of them, stacked like cordwood in the narrow shaft. Men, women, children, their faces turned upward, eyes reflecting my light like stars in the darkness. They were in various states of decay, some little more than bone, others horrifyingly fresh. And at the very top, her face barely below the rim, was a young girl who couldn't have been more than 10. Her eyes opened. I stumbled backward, my light wavering wildly as terror seized my throat. The girl's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the pounding of my heart. But I could read her lips, "Help us." The weeping stopped. The absolute silence that followed was somehow worse, pregnant with malevolent presence. I turned to run, but found my way blocked by a figure that shouldn't have been there, a tall man in a white suit, his face hidden in shadow beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice like grinding stone. "But now that you have, you've seen too much." I tried to push past him, but he was solid as a wall and cold as winter morning. His hand closed on my arm with crushing force, and I smelled the decay on him, not just physical decay, but the moral rot of unspeakable cruelties. "They were my property," he continued, his voice filled with a pride that made my soul recoil. "Every one of them. I own them in life, and I own them still in death. But you're something different. You're here by choice." His face became visible in my failing flashlight beam, pale as bone, with eyes like empty sockets and a mouth that seemed too wide, revealing teeth filed to points. This was no ghost, but something far worse, a soul so corrupted by evil that death itself had rejected it. "You want to know the truth about this place?" he whispered, his breath like grave dirt against my face. "I'll show you." The cellar dissolved around us, replaced by visions of horror that burned themselves into my mind. I saw the plantation in its prime, not the genteel facade it presented to the world, but the reality of systematic torture and murder. I saw children torn from their mothers' arms, sold like livestock. I saw workers beaten to death for imagined slights. I saw the master's family dining upstairs while screams echoed from the cellar below. And I saw how it ended, the night the slaves finally rebelled, burning the house while the family slept. But their master didn't die in the flames. He fled to the cellar, where his victims were waiting. They pulled him down into the well, adding him to their number, but he was too evil to simply die. The visions faded, leaving me gasping on the cellar floor. The man in white was gone, but his laughter echoed from the well, and I could hear movement down there, the sound of bodies shifting, climbing. I ran. Up the stairs, through the kitchen, across the dining room where the 13 chairs now held occupants, shadowy figures that turned to watch me pass. The foyer stretched before me like a tunnel, the front door seeming miles away. Behind me, I could hear them coming, the soft whisper of bare feet on wood, the rustle of burial shrouds, the wet sound of decay in motion. I burst through the front door and didn't stop running until I reached my car. The engine turned over on the third try, and I reversed blindly down the gravel road, not caring about potholes or scratches from overhanging branches. In my rearview mirror, I could see them gathered on the porch, dozens of figures in white, watching me flee. I didn't stop until I reached the interstate, and even then I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see glowing eyes or reaching hands. It wasn't until I was back in my hotel room, door locked and every light blazing, that I allowed myself to process what had happened. The photos on my camera were all black. The audio recorder held nothing but static. There was no evidence of what I'd witnessed, nothing to prove the horrors I'd seen. Part of me wondered if I'd suffered some kind of breakdown, hallucinated the entire experience. But when I showered that night, I found scratches on my arms, 4 parallel lines, like fingernail marks. And in the mirror, I could see a bruise on my throat, finger-shaped and dark as night. I left town the next morning without completing my research. The dissertation would have to find another subject. But as I drove away from that cursed place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was carrying something with me, a darkness that had attached itself to my soul like a parasite. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've been plagued by nightmares of the plantation. I wake screaming most nights, my sheets soaked with sweat that smells like grave dirt. Sometimes I find myself standing at my bedroom window, staring out at nothing, though I have no memory of getting up. And lately, I've been hearing the weeping again. Faint at first, but growing stronger each night. Last week, I found muddy footprints in my apartment, small ones, like a child's. They led from my front door to my bedroom, where they simply stopped. I've started researching the plantation's history, desperate to understand what's happening to me. What I've found makes my blood run cold. The place has a long history of visitors who never returned home. Researchers, thrill seekers, paranormal investigators, all missing, their cars found abandoned on the gravel road. But some do make it out, like me. And according to the local newspaper archives, they all share the same fate. First come the nightmares. Then the sightings, glimpses of figures in white at the edges of vision. Finally, they simply disappear, usually within 6 months of their visit. The pattern is clear, and my time is running out. I can feel them calling to me, those tortured souls in the well. They want me to return, to join them in their eternal suffering. The Master in White appears to me now in dreams, promising that if I come back willingly, he'll make my death quick. If I resist, he'll take his time. I've considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I'm being haunted by the ghosts of murdered slaves? They'd lock me up, and that might be for the best. At least in a padded room, I'd be safe from what's coming for me. But I know it won't work. They've marked me, claimed me. Distance means nothing to the dead, and walls can't keep out something that exists beyond the physical world. So I'm writing this account, hoping that someone will believe it, will learn from my mistake. If you're reading this, it means I'm probably gone, drawn back to that cursed plantation to become another name carved into the chair, another voice in the weeping chorus. Stay away from Millfield Plantation. The dead there don't rest, and the evil that created them still walks among the ruins. Some places are too poisoned by cruelty to ever heal, too stained with blood to ever be clean. The weeping is getting louder now. I can see shapes moving outside my window, pale figures beckoning me to come home. My hands are shaking as I write this, and I can smell the familiar stench of decay growing stronger. They're here for me. If you find this account, remember what I've told you. Some history is better left buried, some truths too terrible to uncover. The plantation holds its secrets in the well, and it guards them jealously. The Master is calling my name now, his voice like wind through a graveyard. The dead children are singing lullabies that curdle the blood. I can't resist much longer. I pray that God will have mercy on my soul, and that he'll forgive me for the horrors I've witnessed and failed to stop. The evil at Millfield Plantation is ancient and patient, and it's not done feeding yet. Don't look for me. Don't follow my footsteps. Let my disappearance be warning enough. The dead are rising from their well, and they're coming to take me home. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button and share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.